Everything was big during the Gilded Age. Industry was big. The fortunes they produced were big. The working class was big. The labor unions they formed were big. Cities were big. Farms were big. The gap between the rich and the poor was big. Everything was being organized into something big. Everything, that is, except the middle class. These were the people who owned small businesses or worked in professions. Their numbers were getting bigger, but they weren't organized. If they didn't get organized, they might be crushed between the rich and the poor. Never had the U.S. seen such separation between rich and poor, at least not outside of the South. The rich weren't always so rich, and the poor weren't always so poor. People of all classes used to live alongside each other. Moving from one class to another was easier, in both physical and socioeconomic terms. In short, being middle class used to be the norm. By the time of the Gilded Age, the middle classes were a throwback to an earlier era. The same could be said for middle class values. Immigration had been changing the country, specifically immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. These new immigrants were poor, didn't speak English, and were Catholic, Orthodox, or Jewish. They had very little in common with the middle class, who tended to be native-born, well-educated, and Protestant. At the same time, the middle class didn't have much in common with the wealthy either. Yes, the wealthy also tended to be native-born, well-educated, and Protestant, but that's where the similarities ended. Middle-class Americans believed hard work, sober living, and honesty led to success. Wealthy Americans, as social Darwinists, believed all was fair in business. Exploiting and lying were part of survival of the fittest. Middle-class people believed in modesty, simple homes, simple clothes, and simple pleasures. The wealthy did what Thorstein Veblen called conspicuous consumption, expensive toys, ornate mansions, and wild parties. What use was being wealthy, after all, if you couldn't enjoy it? So it was normal for middle-class people to feel that the values they held dear, what they considered traditional American values, were disappearing. The social Darwinism of the wealthy struck them as barbaric. The socialism of the poor struck them as foolish. They would formulate their own answers instead. Education helped shape those answers. Many middle-class people had university degrees at a time when university learning was going through a revolution. Subjects like history started relying more on empirical facts like statistics. New subjects like economics and sociology based their theories on data. Education was becoming less deductive and more inductive. Deductive means we already know the truth and draw conclusions about the world based on those truths. Inductive means we can only base our conclusions on the facts. This led many middle-class people to reject social Darwinism. Facts showed that the wealthiest people weren't necessarily the fittest. Many idiots had their fortunes by way of inheritance or dumb luck. Laissez-faire was a myth too. The government never stayed out of economic life. Railroad companies got government land grants, and business owners called on government troops to crush strikes. Social Darwinism and laissez-faire were nothing more than self-serving myths. But the poor also had their myths. Their support of socialism was a recipe for disaster. It violated the sanctity of private property by threatening to take it away or commandeer it for the common good. At worst, socialism meant anarchy and mob rule. At best, it meant the government would be run by a tyrant, like Julius Caesar or Napoleon. So what were middle-class values? They still believed that hard work and honesty was the traditional American path to success. After all, they were living proof of it. However, the Gilded Age made it difficult for those values to win out. Selfish, irresponsible rich people, what some writers called robber barons, used their wealth to rig the system. They bought politicians and controlled industries to stack the deck in their favor. By doing so, they made it more difficult for the middle class and poor to forge an honest path in the world. The system needed to be unrigged. Wealth shouldn't be able to buy political power. It shouldn't be allowed to corner markets. It shouldn't be allowed to run stock scams. It shouldn't be allowed to alter the physical environment with pollution. If the system could be cleaned up, balance could be restored. American values could reign supreme. This, in short, was the progressive outlook. It's tough to pin down exactly what progressivism was because it was so widespread and varied. Not all progressives agreed on everything. But in general, most progressives were middle class, educated, native-born, Protestant, and white. Many of them were women or sympathetic to women's causes. Most were focused on urban life, since that is where the rich and the poor rubbed up against each other the most. And probably most importantly, progressives didn't want revolution the way socialists and communists did. They did not think the entire system needed to be torn down and rebuilt. They thought the capitalist system was mostly a good thing. They believed American representative democracy was a good thing. These things needed to be preserved. They just needed reform. If the wealthy classes prevented reform, if they insisted on a system of unrestrained greed, then the poor would explode in revolution. The progressives often saw themselves as the only hope for peaceful change. As a progressive of a later era, John F. Kennedy once said, "Those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable."